Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first in what I hope is to be many episodes of Back to the BTCC with myself and Ben. Say hello.
Hello.
Now, the reason we're doing these is simply because of the fact that we are both British touring car enthusiasts. Ben has been watching touring cars for how many years, Ben?
20 years now this year.
Blimey. For me, it's only a couple of years.
That's
So,
consistently. Like I did watch bits before that with my granddad and my dad, but this is consistent watching the whole season and everything as well. 20 years exactly.
mine's about 4 years, so I got nothing. But I suppose it's not how long you've been watching it, it's how much you enjoy it. So,
Exactly.
um,
Everyone can be a fan even from turning up to one weekend.
exactly, yeah. I would say like my first, for those that don't know, my first introduction for touring cars was like 2019. So I've only been watching a couple of years, and granted, it's been the Turkington and Sutton show, but I have gone back and watched a lot of season reviews over the last like 20, 30 years,
And I've pushed you in the
including
direction of a few things.
including, but not limited to, the year that we're going to be discussing today, which is the 1998 British Touring Car season. Now, before we start, we do need to mention a couple of things, like one or two things. Firstly, this is just myself and Ben just talking it out regarding everything and anything that was to do with the season. We will probably miss bits. If we do, feel free to let us know in the comments. The next thing, or the main part of this as well, is that for those that don't know or are unaware, there is a team called the 1990s BTCC, I believe. They do something called Stories from Super Touring. If you're into the British touring cars, same as us, would highly recommend checking out their podcast. It's fantastic. They have special guests on. They really go into detail and even give you some surprise trivia that you never knew. Some of their guests include Anthony Reid, John Cleland, and they even did a tribute to Will Hoy as well, the late great Will Hoy, who's also going to be getting a mention during this. But yeah, if you're on to more like of a serious style podcast and want to hear a lot more regarding not just like the touring cars as a whole, but the super touring era more specifically, we're going to be covering a bit outside of that as well as a bit of inside stuff in super touring. But if you're into a bit more of a serious podcast for a good hour, then highly recommend checking those out. I'll leave a link to them in the description. I just thought to kind of like shout that out before we start. But yeah, so we're going to go through. First thing, we're going to split this up into a few bits. So the first thing we're going to cover is the drivers and teams. Second bit will be the calendar. Third bit will be the race format changes. Fourth will be season favourites. And the fifth will be stand-up moments. The sixth one will be to do with TOCA 2 touring cars. So if you're into the video games, that side of things, which I know a lot of my viewers from Viper Racing usually are, and in general from the British touring car crowd, then yeah, stick around because we will be talking about that. Anyway, let's start with the first part. So, who was involved in the 1998 British Touring Car Championship? Well, we had Williams Renault, or Blend 37 Williams Renault, as it was known, running the Renault Laguna with Alain Menu and Jason Plato as its drivers. Volvo ran the S40 with Ricard Rydell and Gianni Morbidelli at the wheel. Team Honda ran the Honda Accord with James Thompson and Peter Cox. Audi Sport continued to run their Audi A4 with John Bincliffe at the head of the operation, with Ivan Muller in the second seat. Vodafone Nissan Racing ran their Nissan Primera GT with David Leslie and Anthony Reid taking up both of their seats. Tiff Needell actually made a surprise appearance, but we'll get onto him a bit later on. The Peugeot team, or SO Ultron Team Peugeot, continued to run the 406 with Tim Harvey and Paul Radisich at the wheel. Ford Mondeo Racing still ran, obviously, the Ford Mondeo with Will Hoy and Craig Baird at the wheel, with Nigel Mansell making an appearance on 3 occasions. Again, we will come back to our Nige a bit later on. And Vauxhall ran the Vectra once again with Derek Warwick and John Cleland at the wheel, with Flavio Figueiredo. Can't actually pronounce the last name, I do apologise. Figueiredo, is it? I don't know.
Yeah, no idea.
Who stood in for one race at round 9. So that was the drivers and teams. Now, there was actually something that we're going to mention here. We'll mention it a bit later on as well. But Alfa Romeo was originally on the list to run their 156 with Nicola Larini and Fabrizio Giovanardi, who would later go on to become a double British Tourer Car World Champion himself. They're originally going to run the 156 in the 98 season, but for some reason didn't, just never appeared and everything. Yeah, it just never happened.
Yeah, they even had driver numbers 56 for Larini and 57 for Giovanardi. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, they had everything like put in place. They kept backtracking it until August, and yeah, nothing came.
In terms of the independents, there was a private Vauxhall Vectra being run by Mark Lemmer under the Mint Motorsport team. Mardi Gras Motorsport ran a Honda Accord with Roger Moen at the wheel. DC Cup Motorsport ran a Renault Laguna and a Honda Accord with Tommy Rustad and Paula Cook at the wheel. Brooks Motorsport ran two Honda Accords with Lee Brooks and Rob Gravitt at the wheel. And Team Dynamics, Max Power, ran the Nissan Primera GT with good old Matt Neal at the wheel. In terms of the calendar, we started on the 13th of April with Thruxton hosting the opening round. Then came Silverstone International on the 26th of April. Donington Park on the 4th of May, running the national layout. Brands Hatch Indy, the first of two meetings at Brands Hatch Indy on the 17th of May. Alton Park Fosters ran on the 25th of May. We then went back to Donington Park National Circuit on the 14th of June. Croft held its first or second British Touring Car meeting ever on the 28th of June. Stetson held theirs on the 26th of July. Then it went back to Thruxton again on the 2nd of August. Knockhill held its one and only event of the year on the 16th of August. We then went back to Brands Hatch Indy on the 31st of August. With Alton Park following up from that 2 weeks later with the Foster Circuit. And finally, a week following that, we had the Silverstone International Circuit, which rounded out the season on the 20th of September. Moving on to our next point. So I mentioned before about the race format changes. So in 1998, we saw the introduction of the sprint and the feature race. So it was one sprint, one feature race per meeting. The sprints lasted anywhere between 10 to 20 laps, with the feature lasting much longer and having a mandatory pit stop. And just going to come to you on this one, Ben, but in terms of what happened in 97 with the dominance of Renault and Alain Menu, do you think it really mixed up the format for 98? Did it make the racing more unpredictable?
It was a weird one because obviously everything happened in like 97. 97 you can see was like a very strong sort of season for like pretty much one manufacturer, and then one or two, got the dibs here and there, which usually happens, but it was like very heavily to Renault side. So it's sort of like coming into 98, a lot of people would have, myself included, gone with Renault. You thought, well, it should be something. But then obviously coming out of testing, nobody had a clue because there was quite a few who were all looking insanely strong. So yeah, it was a weird one.
Yeah, it's one of them, isn't it, really? I think with the introduction of the sprint and the feature race, given the season that we end up actually having for 1998, I think it did well to mix up the format. I mean, granted, okay, you could say, well, the rules made the racing better. You could always say that the rules made racing better. That's what the rule sets can do. But in terms of a race format making things better, would you say it's like you tune in for it a bit like... So, for example, given how 1997 was with their races, let me put it to you this way. So it's like with the sprint and the feature, obviously, like, so the sprint is a shorter race to the feature. Would you say it gives you more, not enthusiasm, but more attention to watch both races because they're now different lengths? It's not like they're both, you're watching two 25-lap races at a race meeting.
Yeah, it's easy for people to obviously come and watch the sprints. So if you got your people who don't like the long race, the sprints, everything filled into one, like you'd have it nowadays, where you sort of have everything, it's all packed, it doesn't last too long. You sort of got no more than 20 laps, you've got a good amount of time on track. You can easily fit it into under an hour with a couple of cautions or whatever else thrown into the mix. Easily. Whereas the feature obviously had a lot more on track, but for your proper fans who want a good amount of action, you want to see something, you want that unpredictability of the pit stop, you've got that as well.
I think that the other thing is as well is that with it being the British Touring Car Championship, I think this kind of goes without saying, not just for the 1998 season, but any season, is because of the British weather playing its part. That mandatory pit stop in the feature was always a case of, like, normally in a dry race, okay, yeah, you just change, like, I don't know, the front tyres, or you change just the left-hand side tyres, or the rear tyres, or whichever. But with the weather playing a factor as well, like, when it rains, you always think, this is going to be chaos. And more than often
should you
than
slap
not,
them into zone?
yeah, more often than not, we actually had races in the wet where it was like you'd have wets on the rear and intermediates on the front or something like that. It was a bizarre, very bizarre, like set of tires or tire choices, shall we say, that people were trying out. And I think it kind of opened the door for that, didn't it? For future seasons as well. Like we'd seen it before in past seasons, but I think it definitely opened the door for even more strategy calls to happen.
Yeah, exactly. You had to plan. Like, you really had to plan. Because if you came in for that pit stop, when you know it's just about to rain, then depending on obviously when you have to do it and everything, then it could come out one way or the other. You could bag your tyres correctly and beat the weather, or you could just completely throw all caution to the wind and just your car slid off track and it's coming back in regardless whether you want it to or not.
Exactly. It was a bit of a, like I said, bit of a madhouse regarding strategy. Speaking of madhouse, let's move on to the next part, which is season favourites. So, pre-season saw Volvo, Nissan, Renault, and Honda all looking strong, but with testing being like it is, obviously no one had any idea who'd come out on top, especially before the first round of the season. In terms of what we was looking at in terms of the pre-season back then, Ben, who would you say your favourite for the title would be?
What driver?
Well, driver and team. Who would you have put your money on back then?
Renault I would have put on for manufacturers because of obviously the previous season. Even though I hadn't seen what would happen in the sort of sprint feature scenario, but even then I had a high hope on them based on what I sort of know. Like if I just go back on before first race, and then I would have maybe just put my hand on Plato because I've always been like a Plato sort of see what he can bring to the table fan, like kept being up and coming. I remember back at this point it was sort of with Renault as well, this point was sort of let's see what he could do.
Yeah, I think with the way that Renault was in '97, I think the way I looked at it was that because in 1997 Renault was like the class of the field, head and shoulders above the rest by far.
Yeah,
with how many wins they got in '97, it would have been a bit daft to put your money against them. But I personally think if it was back then, looking at it then, I probably would have put my money on James Thompson, because in the previous years leading up to that, like obviously he came into the British touring cars in '95 with Vauxhall and the Cavalier, I believe it was his first year, and he did well when he was racing John Cleland in the Vectra. He didn't do too bad, obviously. Then he moved to Honda in '97, and given like a young age and the fire that he showed during like several race meetings, for me, I think he really stood a chance of standing on that. No, not just standing on the top step of the podium, but winning the title. I think he had the fire in him and everything like that. I think he showed that he did have some great racecraft. Granted, he was quite an aggressive competitor, but then again, a lot of the guys back then was. But in terms of like who I'd put me on, yeah, I'd definitely go with Thompson. Me. In terms of the manufacturers, I would have gone with Nissan. I mean, Nissan, I think believe this did actually end up winning the 98 season in terms of manufacturers. So I wasn't wrong if I would have bet back then, but Nissan were a team that were on the rise. 97 was an interesting year for them because obviously they had Leslie and Reed at the wheel. But 98 was, the team was so strong, especially with Reed, or
Yeah, as I
Reedy,
say,
as we found out. But I think that as a whole, like the backing that Nissan gave it, the mechanics behind the scenes, and I don't know. There was just something about that car that just seemed to just go, like, from the very first lights out. Like, granted, obviously, we know who won the title and stuff in the end with Rydell, but you could never really discount Nissan out. I think it was just because of, like, obviously, there was a few errors on Reed's behalf, and there was the Brands Hatch shenanigans, that we'll call it, which we'll get
yeah.
into shortly. But, yeah, I think Nissan had a really strong team. What do you think?
Well, it was usually like the car of choice and manufacturer choice for the independents as well, wasn't it, back then?
It
It
was
was,
back then, yeah. I suppose,
yeah, I
and with
remember sort
Neil
of
as
like
well.
Matt Neal, yeah, that's the big one, innit? Everybody knows that.
I think it's fair to say that before 99, Neil was starting to get known in touring. I mean, Neil was already known in touring cars by
Yeah.
this point, but he wasn't, like, as well known as he is, like, in today's standard.
No, it was sort of like him and Plato back then was just slowly getting through the ranks. Like I said, Plato was on his stride getting up there, and the same with Neil.
Whereas, like,
Both in
Rydell and
different.
Menu had already been around for a couple of years, hadn't they? And
Yeah, they
really
were well
showed they could
known.
mix it with the big boys.
Yeah, exactly. They'd been around for a while and been in loads of different cars, and they know what to go on with loads of different types of cars and everything. Especially with Rydell, he'd been through like the scenes with Volvo and everything, hadn't he? Really?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The one thing I will say, though, is so in terms of, like, obviously with the mechanical side of things, not mechanical, sorry, with the rulings, with the race format changes and everything. Do you think the race format, and it's going to sound like a bit of a stupid question, but do you think the race format changing helped any of these four teams, so Volvo, Nissan, Renault, or Honda, in any way, do you think, compared to 97?
Um, I think it's a good way of looking at leveling off a bit and giving other teams like Volvo, Nissan, and Honda a bit more of a bigger chance because you now at least know that Renault hasn't planned for that as such. Like you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, especially with a pit stop. A pit stop is a unknown. You can make your team practice, you can make your people, practice the pit stop over and over again. But anything could happen in a race leading up to that pit stop. You could get a puncture. Your driver could come in, take the pit stop, and then as they took the pit stop, that's it. That's sort of they can't come back in then. They've got to cope for the rest of the race, coming in for an early pit stop and somehow trying to get back up there. Obviously, there's one mandatory, but you don't really want to go in for another one because that's just wasted time.
And
So
given
I
and
think
given the fact it's not like an F1 pit crew in touring
yeah,
cars, yeah, it'd
yeah,
take a lot longer.
that's what I mean, guys with a hammer having fun. It's sort of like you got to expect like some of these lads.
It's like, right, Larry,
Obviously,
get the duct tape out where they
yeah,
left it.
exactly. Let's get Cleland back out on track. It's sort
I
of that.
mean, they still do it nowadays with touring cars, but back then, I
Yeah.
mean, we could obviously go on about, like, oh, I remember when they used to duct tape the bonnet down on cars if it came up and stuff, but they still do it now. It's
Yeah,
not,
they still do it now.
granted, not as extreme as they used to do it.
No, I think the only one that happened like last season was where that pit guy went and like the mechanic smacked the bonnet, didn't he? Punched the dent to make the bonnet close. That was it. And that was a big thing that everybody talked about. But it's always been done. I think that's the thing what stands out for British touring cars for everybody is the fact that you can see it's serious, but there's them bits you can look and go. It's a bit like rallying where you smack the car with a rock to get it carrying on. You'll do anything just to get it back out on track as quick as you can.
Reminds me of a Mr. McRae that in
Yeah,
1997, I think it was, or something,
that's
or
what I mean. And that's the bit what always made me love British touring cars over a load of other sports. Is just you got that mentality of smack it a few times, duct tape it, send it back out. Come on, we might get still some points at the end of this. So you've always had that sort of your pit crew isn't like an all round, like you said, an F1 style pit crew. They're not. They won't be, but you do have a couple of teams in there where they do have connections to them sort of pit crews, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of them were a bit more ready as well. Obviously, Renault with Williams and everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of them,
So
isn't it, really?
it brings in a lot of different things that could make anything happen.
Well, speaking of anything can happen, 1998, it bloody did, didn't it?
It literally did.
We had quite a bit. Well, we might as well move on to the next point, which is or the next section, which is going to be standout moments of the season. Obviously, there's a lot to cover in this. We are going to be covering a fair few. Obviously, we're going to mention a couple of things that did change and things like that. But we might as well start out with two of the biggest ones. We'll start out with Brands Hatch Indy in August. Now, this was quite well known for two reasons. The first reason was to do with, well, we might as well kill two birds with one stone here. So, Brands Hatch Indy in August was known for two reasons. It was known for a Mr. Nigel Mansell, our Nige, who got involved in a pile-up in both races. I say a pile-up, he got taken out, I think, in the sprint race, and then the feature race spun off under his own accord and stacked it in tyre wall. And blamed it on Peter Cox in the Honda, I believe, was the word.
Yeah, he said the Hondas. I saw a Honda go past because it's the famous thing we see him quizzing the people who are filming him, for like the interview. He's like, he looks at him, you could see him go, it was a Honda, wasn't it? You could see him looking at him, it's like, oh, God.
Yeah, and he's like, it was a Honda, was it? I hope the onlookers saw that one and stomped back to the pit. So that was the first thing that one was known for. But the main one was what came in the feature race, which was Anthony Reid versus Ricard Rydell. And obviously during the race, there was plenty of action left, right, and centre, and a lot of overtaking going on. Not to cut anybody out of this, but the main talking point that came out of it, it doesn't matter what happened in that race, the last thing that came out of it was what happened for the lead of the race. And it was a case of, as they came up to, I believe it was after they came up Graham Hill into, I think it was Druids Corner, something like that, coming to the hairpin, and Rydell had supposedly put his brakes on a bit early. Now, in Reid's words, this was in Anthony Reid's words, he said basically he'd put his brakes on a bit earlier than what he usually did, and they touched a little bit, and he moved past. That was it. He said, as far as I'm concerned, it was a racing incident. Rydell had the opposite and said he nearly pushed me off the circuit. What came of this was a very explosive on TV as well, I believe it was. It was even shown on TV afterwards. A very explosive exchange between Rydell and Reid, with Rydell ripping his steering wheel off almost, throwing it on the dashboard, going straight over to Reid, slamming ripping the door open, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck. He's like, "I'm going to have you. Next time I see you, I'm going to have you." And I mean, granted, yes, tensions get high in touring cars, but in terms of that incident, Ben, I mean, we'll briefly cover this, but in terms of that incident, who was right and who was wrong? Was it a racing incident, or was it 20% of one and 80% of the other? What do you think it was?
See, in touring cars, you obviously have a bit of banging, a bit of ashing, and a bit of scraping. And for me, I wouldn't really say it was worth anything of. I would have more obviously I get Rydell got, he wasn't impressed of it, but me, I would have held it in and just thought, you know what, whenever the next race is, whatever it is, I'll just remember this. I wouldn't have gone much into it. I'd have thought, he's done this to me, see what happens. Because I don't remember Reid doing much else to him apart from this. There might be something that I'm missing, but for me, I'd be like, he's done it to me this once, unless it happens again, I'll just remember he's done it. Do you know what I mean?
Well, as far as I'm aware,
so the rest of that sort of like a racing incident as such.
I mean, in terms of the rest of that year, there wasn't really much on. I mean, obviously they end up fighting for a championship anyway. This was in the latter end of the season, so yeah. I think it was a case of tensions were running high. Reid had everything to prove. Rydell, he knew that he had the better of Reid, but that day, I think it was a case of, because Rydell had won Brands Hatch earlier on in the season, he got a double win. obviously he must have gone to Brands Hatch, the second meeting, with the idea that, I've won them first two races. I've won them races. I could probably do it again. Obviously, Reed was like, I need to start winning races if I'm going to get back in this championship. Obviously, he ended up winning the sprint for that August meeting, but when push came to shove, it was, I don't know. I mean, for me, where I was sat, I saw him. It looked like on the TV coverage, it didn't look like anything more than Rydell was going a bit slow and Reed pushed his way past. Not like shoved him wide and then went right past. The more I watch it, the more I'm like, no, I think he was in his right, but at the same time, I can't say 100%. I think racing incident, to be honest. I don't think there was any need for a penalty that came after it.
No, exactly. I don't think there were much to it, apart from, like I would have said, in Rydell's defence, I would have just gone, I'll remember it. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, he got his own back in the end because he won the title against Reed.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I think he got his
That's
own
the point.
back, really.
When I won, if I was Rydell, once I'd won the championship, I go, balls to him, I've won now. I'm the better man. End of.
Exactly.
And I would have left it there. But yeah, it went a bit further than it needed to have.
So speaking of with the season though, with regarding to our Nigel, I know we touched on him before, but with Mansell Mania hitting at Brands Hatch and him being at Donington and everything like that, fair to say Mansell Mania took over, didn't it, in the 1998 season, Ben?
Yeah, him and that Mondeo became like iconic for sort of. Everybody knows Nigel Mansell, has done BTCC, he was in a blue Mondeo. It became massive. Like, it was something completely different. Like, basically just a superstar, from F1 coming in, as big as he was back then as well, just coming in and showing off what he could sort of do against, obviously, your favourites from BTCC.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's a case of like when he obviously came in 1998 season, all eyes were on him. I've no doubt about that because obviously with him being in British motorsport in general, 1992 Formula One champion, he was a kart champion in '93, I think it was. He was very well looked at. For multiple reasons. But with that, this becomes a bit of a standout moment for the season because obviously we can't go without mentioning his stunning drive that he did, which unfortunately didn't end in what we wanted, which was a fairy tale ending, which was at Donington Park that year in the wet, where he nearly won it. With how he passed all the cars, everyone was going off because of how wet it was, and Nigel was there. Not saying he made it look easy, but he was passing these cars left, right, and centre. He was passing blooming, Reed and everything. And there was even the part where Reed locked his rear brakes, went off. Everyone thought Mansell had hit him. Then there's like Leslie and Cleland and Mansell in middle, and there's this massive. There's a video online. I'd highly recommend anyone go and watch it. You can easily find it. A clip of Mansell going door to door with all these cars around him. You've got like Cleland in the Vauxhall and Leslie in the Nissan, and I think there was Thompson in the Honda as well, and they're all just like banging into each other. Obviously, it's all in wet. They're all keeping it on the tarmac, and he ended up overtaking them and everything. But it ended up becoming a showdown between him and John Cleland, which was fascinating to watch. And Cleland had really good pace that day in the wet. But for those that don't know, there was actually something that happened earlier on in the weekend. Now, this was courtesy of John Cullen mentioning this to the BTCC lads I mentioned before about that stories and Super Touring. Is that when Mansell obviously signed up, he signed with Ford and everything for the year for 3 appearances. And he first went out on track, and John Cleland was the car behind him. And according to John, he said, so when the cars went out onto the track, first thing you usually do is test your brakes because, well, you need to make sure they work, especially if the tarmac's wet. You need to make sure the brakes work.
Them off and on, job done.
Yeah, you need to make sure that they work. Anyway, when Nigel Mansell went out for the first time, he didn't do this, and Cleland thought he was a bit of a nutcase, so he didn't know how to drive. One or the other. Anyway, now this is in John Cleland's words himself. He said that what happened was that because he didn't know what he was, he thought he didn't know what he was doing. He flung it up the inside after the Senna S's, I believe it was, up into going under the famous Dunlop sign, not the Dunlop curve that you had, on the back straight, but like up after the S's, that bit going under the bridge, and he threw it up the inside and floored it past him and everything like that. And apparently, what had happened was when Mansell and Cleland came back into the pits, either at the end of that session or during that session or some point like that, Mansell was absolutely furious, went up to John Cleland and was like, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" and all the rest of it. And John Cleland responded with the best line I've ever heard, which was, "Welcome to touring cars, pal." Genuinely, I don't think you can get any more of a character than John Cleland personally, but obviously Mansell didn't know what he was getting into and things like that. He quickly realised what he was getting into at Donington. Obviously, brands went a lot different for him, but in terms of that Donington Park event, Ben, what was not to like about that event? There was everything to like, weren't there? Really?
It's iconic. Like you say, it could have been a fairy tale ending if he won, but it's not looked bad on us. He didn't do well. Like you said, with him passing and going for it in the wet, he showed off, this is Nigel Mansell. He's in BTCC, for these appearances. It got the fans there. One of the people even I know at work, who I work with, he was there as a child and he can remember it to this day. And when I told him we do this podcast, he said, "Oh, I remember that." And so even he can still remember it clear as day that he was there. He saw it, said he got absolutely soaked. And he said he just remembers Nigel Mansell going fast in the car, just bouncing around everybody.
I think at this point as well, it's become etched into so many people's minds. Whether you're an old touring car fan or a new one, the one thing you will hear about is how Nigel Mansell came into touring cars and nearly won it. Not without trying, but he nearly won it.
He did a good job
without even thinking about it. This is the same kind of. If I'm being honest, Ben, would you agree with me on this? Would you say it's right up there with like other famous moments like John Cleland's going for first and all the rest of it?
Yes, definitely, without a doubt. Like this was obviously when it was super touring. You had your greats and you had the moments. You had the commentary of Murray Walker. It set itself up for you. Had the power like BBC, and you had everything going for it at this point. It couldn't have been like much more of a peak if it tried.
Well, speaking of Ford, with the Mondeo and everything, though, here's another thing as well. So this is another standout moment of the year for me personally, which was Will Hoy getting his last touring car win in the Mondeo at Silverstone that year. I guess it showed, really. It was a bit of a weird one. So Ford had a bit of an up and down season in 1998. But one thing it did show was that, I suppose, that it's like the cunning old fox still got it in him. Like Hoy at this point, it had been, he'd still been winning races here, there, and everywhere in the British touring car since he won the title back in 1991 with BMW. But I think it was a very well-deserved win as well, and I think it supposedly proved that despite the Mondeo not being the quickest car in the field, with the right driver behind the wheel, anything was possible. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And it's just, it showed that, Hoy still had it and everything. And if anybody wants to look up on what happened with Hoy, it's very sad. And obviously that you want much more after this, where everything sort of came through and it sadly changed for the worse. So it's nice to look on that as well and watch that last win, how Hoy looked on the podium and everything. And like you said, it's good for Ford for that season as well.
I mean, if we're going to look at like manufacturers as a whole, we might as well turn our attention to a few other ones as well. So Peugeot this year were pretty much bottom of the table in the end, and there was that one particular moment. I can't remember if there was another moment during that season, but I remember there was that one particular moment at Thruxton where Tim Harvey nearly scored Peugeot a win. during wet conditions and just couldn't quite pull it off. I think there was a bad taste in strategy, a bad turn in strategy, and they weren't able to win it. I forget the reason why, but yeah, it was a bit of a sad one really with Peugeot, wasn't it? It was a case of they'd not been on the pace the previous year. I don't think they'd been on the pace for at least a year or two. But to see him at the
Yeah.
bottom and the fact that there was obviously with that near miss. I don't know. Was it? Would you say it was a standout moment?
Yeah, it's sort of weird to see like someone like them just sort of they just weren't there. There was something not quite right in the team at this point for Peugeot, definitely. Like something wasn't clicking, they maybe want to get in a grip with the rules or something, but there was something just not quite right.
Yeah, it wasn't too great for Peugeot, to be fair. Unfortunately, as well, they actually dropped out at the end of the year. We'll get onto that in a minute. But just carrying on with the manufacturer stuff, though, Vauxhall had an interesting season. They scored 3 wins. Cleland obviously got that one at Donington. He got another one later in the season. Warwick got his. Derek Warwick scored his one and only win of the season at Knockhill before he hung up his racing gloves for good. But Vauxhall's season was another one to think about, really, wasn't it? It was kind of what could have been.
Yeah, there was a couple of like weekends where stuff didn't quite go their way. So Vauxhall could have had more from it, but they had them 3 wins, which, like I say, compared to ones like Persia and everything, was far much better. But the Vauxhall of old wasn't there as such.
They had no idea what kind of a run they would have in future years, did they?
No clue. Same with Persia. Persia had no clue what was coming in like 2001.
No, exactly. Well, we might as well bring up the elephant in the room as well. The two of the biggest teams in the sport in the 90s as well, without a doubt, was Renault and Audi. Audi obviously won the title in 96, Renault won it in 97. Both of them were well off the pace. Audi was worse off than Renault, though. Renault did manage to score 4 race wins, but that was nothing compared to the 14 they'd scored in the previous season. Again, whether it was down to the ruling or due to a technical switch or something like that, it was an interesting one. It was I suppose in a way it was good to see that Renault had their wings clipped. It's the same with, I suppose, if you have one team dominating a season, it can make a season quite boring. I think British Touring Car was trying to get away from that. Like they'd seen it with, Alpha did it in 94. Vauxhall had a fight with Renault in 95, so that was kind of 50-50. But then Audi dominated 96. Renault dominated 97. I think in this year it was like, we don't want a dominant year. We want to see multiple race winners. Granted, it was the Rydell versus Reed show for most of the year for the title. But you had Plato did manage to get a win, Menu got a couple of wins. Obviously, then you had James Thompson, Reed, Rydell obviously all won. And obviously Hoy and so on. A lot of people did manage to get wins that year. Audi, the reason why I bring up Audi, though, is because, so, for those that were not aware, you probably do know this already, but if you were not aware, the 4-wheel drive that Audi had in 1996 that made them win, essentially, it wasn't that, I'd say, let's be honest, it was the main thing that made them win in 96, but 97, it was down to, right, okay, you're gonna you still have the 4-wheel drive system, but we're gonna add weight to the car to make sure that's to pull you back so that the rest of the teams can catch up. It kind of worked, but obviously they still had the 4-wheel drive system. For 1998, though, this was banned. As such, they had to use a front-wheel drive Audi A4. So what was supposed to be an A4 Quattro was an A4 Quattro with front-wheel drive. It didn't work, and unfortunately, it was the first and last time that car would be used, with Audi that pulled out at the end of the year. But in terms of summing Audi's season up, to go from hero to zero, it just kind of summed up how quick how quick things can change, doesn't it, man?
Yeah,
In British Touring Car.
It summed up that once rules change, some teams can never get back. Like you have that one particular aspect, and as soon as it's clipped, you're like, oh, that was our thing.
Exactly.
And that sort of was it for Audi, really.
I mean, it's like with Alfa Romeo. I mean, we might as well mention the one that never happened. So Alfa Romeo, as I said before, they were supposed to be in the championship. They never appeared. They even paid for slots on the grid. They even had driver numbers, as Ben mentioned earlier on, which was quite odd. They were rumoured to be entering the championship in the latter half of the season. Why they
Around
would, I don't know.
August time, I think it was Bruxton or something.
But again, this never happened. We'll never know why. But the thing is that Alpha seemed to continue that trend of saying they were going to enter and never did. There was even rumours that they were entering in the early 2000s at some point. Again, this never happened neither. They did eventually enter back into the British touring cars, albeit with the Giulietta. I think there was the World Touring Car Championship. They entered back into that in the mid-2000s. So they did enter touring cars again, but it was a long time before they were ever seen in touring cars again. There was also, again, this was, speaking of like the season as a whole, this season was actually the last time the British touring car had as many main manufacturers. We do have about the same manufacturers nowadays as we did back in 1998. However, nowadays it's split between independent and the main manufacturers. Back then it was just manufacturers, and we had 8 manufacturers. We did see, as I said, we saw Audi and Peugeot drop out for 1999. However, they both returned in 2001 and 2011 respectively. 2001, I believe, was with Dan Eves and Tim Harvey or something like that, somewhere along the lines. 2011 for Audi, when they came back with Rob Austin, good old Rob Austin, for those that remember him. And whilst we're mentioning stand-up moments, I think we can't really go without mentioning Matt Neal, because obviously 99 was more his year, but 98 was still a great year for Neal himself. He did a great job in terms of like the independent side of things. He qualified quite well for most of the season, scored 3 fifth places overall at Donington and both Brands Hatch meetings, but unfortunately, despite qualifying well, it was actually Tommy Rustad who won the Independence Trophy outright. Showing that races were what mattered, not qualifying, but still, just an overall mention of the standout moments. But Ben, have you got any other standout moments for the year, would you say?
We've covered pretty much a majority of it. Like you said, you did Mansell Mania and all. Obviously, where everybody stood with the favourites of the champions themselves, and obviously like the manufacturers. It was different with that sprint feature race, everything, and obviously having your pit stop. It was an interesting season, and like you say, you had obviously Peugeot and Audi left because they wasn't quite happy, or whatever the case was behind the scenes. It was completely different, like change, like you say. This was one of the last times for a long time we had as many manufacturers in the game. So it was interesting to see that sort of what happened. Like some drivers left, quite a few stayed. People like Neil and Plato got bigger and bigger after this season. So yeah, it's a good season to go back on and look at. Definitely a lot of things that stand out and make it such an interesting thing.
I mean, the one person that I mentioned before, so my favourite for a title was James Thompson. I know I didn't mention him as overall during the season, but he was one that kind of went under the radar. I mean, he finished 3rd in the championship, scored a fair few podiums, even won a race or two. That Honda wasn't too bad that year. I mean, he finished ahead of, to be honest, behind Rydell and Reed, finishing 3rd in the standings. He finished ahead of both Renaults. The Nissan and Leslie, and so on. But he was kind of one that went under the radar, I think. He did put in some really good drives during the course of that year.
He kept his head down and sort of stayed out of the main fights, which sometimes, as we found out in the past, is a way of odd occasion winning the championship, because you come to the end and then you go, oh crap, you're still within the title. And if you get lucky, you can sometimes sneak past.
Exactly.
Obviously, it didn't happen, but still, 3rd is still really well. Like I say, I picked Plato for the year. Like I would have gone with him at the start. Like I knew he probably never got there, but obviously he got to I think he wanted 5th at the end or something, which still bloody well done to have got to this point with how Super Touring cars going. You had that many people in it.
Yeah, the thing is before people start saying, "No, well, there wasn't this many people." This was back when touring cars. No offense to touring cars nowadays, but touring cars back in 1998, in
Most people are
particular, this
household
season
name.
was a case of it was very competitive compared to the following year in '99, where a lot of manufacturers kind of dropped out and there was only a couple left. 98 was the last, if you want to call it this, the last true year of super touring. Before we ended up started losing manufacturers, and eventually we lost like a lot of them. Actually, we lost a few in for 99. Obviously, we lost quite a lot for 2000, but 98 was the last like main big championship fight. Obviously, that's not to put anything off 99 or 2000. Those years were pretty good as well. But for 98, it was one of them years. And speaking of one of them years as well, we can't go without mentioning. I think the main thing that everybody liked about that 1998 season, and one thing that everybody remembers, it was of course TOCA 2 touring cars for the PlayStation 1 and PC, the video game side of things, the last British touring car video game. Obviously, we did have TOCA World Touring Cars, but it was the last, if I can call it this, please don't kill me, the last great British touring car video game we ever got. That was like fully licensed with all the teams and everything like that. Unfortunately, it didn't include independents, but was quite a well-known game and still goes down today in the British touring car community as that game that everybody played, whether it was like ramming people off or, you know, doing the challenge mode or racing around Loch Ness or whatever. It was quite an interesting time for sure. But overall, yeah, I'd say that like the 1998 season was pretty good, and yeah, what do you reckon, Ben?
Yeah, it definitely was great. Like I say, with TOCA touring cars as well, that was just one of them classic games that a lot of people remember at the time. You could just have a laugh, smash the cars off the track, do what you want. You know, it had it all. And like you say, after that, it's probably one of the last great seasons of Super Touring for everything that happened. So definitely interesting for us to have covered as our first one, but it won't be our last.
Exactly. There is one last thing as well that I'd like to mention, which is that even though we have done the 1998 season, obviously we have plenty more seasons on the way to come. We would like to thank you all for obviously listening to this. Obviously, this is going to be quite a long one for a lot of people to listen to, and we appreciate everyone's patience for doing so. Many thanks to everyone for just like for listening to it, and any feedback regarding what we've talked about, as in like if we made any mistakes, feel free to correct us. If there was anything that we missed or your own personal standout moments, let us know down in the comments section. We hope you've enjoyed the first of many episodes of the Back to the BTCC podcast that we're doing. These will be as and when we can get them uploaded, so stick around when the next one comes out. Obviously, we are going to have our usual BTCC content up very, very soon, as well as our other British Touring Car show, which is BTCC Bite Size. We're going to try and start getting those up as and when we can. Many thanks to Ben for joining me today, and hopefully we will see you very, very soon for our next BTCC video. So on that note, Ben, any final thoughts before we go?
Goodbye. Thank you to everybody who's listened this far, and yeah, look forward to many more interesting things from us too.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much, everyone. Have yourselves a great evening. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you all in the next video. Until then, ta-ra.
Bye.